In this video, I'm going to show you an example of a one-sample z-test, also known as a single-sample z-test. The example we're going through right now is the same 5 steps as what we did in the previous unit or the previous chapter. The only difference really is going to be in step 2, we're looking at a different kind of comparison distribution. In the previous chapter's example, we were looking at how we were trying to see whether one single individual, that was our sample, we were trying to see if that one individual was statistically significantly different than a known population. See if they were likely to be different from a known population. In this example, it's the same sort of idea. The only difference is we're looking at a sample, in this case of 64 individuals. We're trying to see if the average of that sample is statistically significantly different than a known population. But it's still a z-test, it's still the same sort of idea, but because we have a sample of individuals, it changes something in a very important way about the comparison distribution. In the last chapter, the comparison distribution was a known population. In this case, the comparison distribution isn't the population itself, it's a distribution of means. And there's more in your book and online about what that means. It's explained better in my online notes than I'll be able to explain it briefly in this video. But in short, what a distribution of means is, it's a hypothetical distribution, but we can show that the distribution of means would approximate what we're estimating it to be. So a distribution of means is like if you did the same exact study with the same exact number of individuals over and over and over and over. Let's say you did the same study 100 times. Now, you're not really going to do that in reality, but we can estimate if we did try to do that and we did the study 100 times and we calculated a mean on something 100, for each of those 100 studies, and then all we did was we didn't take the individuals from all those studies, but we took the mean calculated for all 100 studies, and we put the means into a distribution. In other words, we put the means, the 100 means, into like a histogram, this sort of distribution. That distribution, that's a distribution made out of means. It's a distribution of means. That's going to be the sort of thing that is our comparison distribution for this example and for several chapters that are coming soon. So in this example, we're looking at the idea that, let's say in an experiment, some people are told that other people have some positive personality characteristics. So you might think, well, personality is subjective. No one agrees on who has a good personality. Well, that's true in some ways. That's not entirely true. There's lots of consistency, for example. There's lots of research on this. People generally rate people that are very agreeable as better potential romantic partners. They rate people that are less neurotic. They don't like neurotic people as romantic partners, or as friends, by the way. So some people are going to be considered to have quote unquote better personalities in terms of being a good long-term romantic partner, or maybe a long-term friend. So the idea here is that if people are told that some people have some of these positive personality qualities, that they're going to rate them as more attractive, let's say, for a long-term romantic partner. So we have to translate that idea into thinking about populations, a population 1 and a population 2, and into a research hypothesis and a null hypothesis. So step 1 is the exact same as last time. Think about what is the population you're talking about. And it's kind of weird to use that term population like this because, for example, in population 1 right here, we don't know anything about it's kind of just like an imaginary population, but it's the kind of population that maybe it's a situation that you've set up in your experiment, in your study. So the population is like imaginary, like if we did this to like all the people who could be put in this situation, what would they score like? That's what that's what population one is. It's imaginary, but you're trying to use your sample to estimate something about what that population might look like, for example. So population one here, it's kind of like the experimental condition. It's the students who are told that the person has positive personality qualities. Population two is the let's say students from the general population that are told nothing about the person's personality characteristics. So in last chapter's example, population two was our comparison distribution. In this example, because we're looking at a sample of individuals, we are comparing in a sense to something that's it's related to population two, but the distribution we're going to be comparing to is the distribution of means for population two. And hopefully as we go through this, you'll see what I mean by that. So we need to translate it into a research hypothesis and a null hypothesis. The research hypothesis is kind of like what you're predicting. So we're expecting if we tell people good things about these people's personality, they're going to rate them as more attractive. So the research hypothesis is that population one is going to give, on average, higher attractiveness ratings to the people because they're told good things about their personality compared to population two. The null hypothesis has to cover every other possibility. So null usually means zero, so in your head you should roughly think of it as the no difference hypothesis, zero difference hypothesis. But because we have a directional prediction here, we're predicting that population one is going to be higher in their ratings than population two gives. Because of that, the null hypothesis could be no difference, or it could be the opposite. It could mean that for some weird reason, when people are told positive personality qualities, they gave lower attractiveness ratings. So it's unlikely, but it seems like it's a logical possibility, I guess. So the null hypothesis, either there's no difference, meaning that the two means are equal, or that population two might actually rate the personalities higher. So second step, determine the characteristics of the comparison distribution. Now again, this is where the difference is between last chapter and this chapter. Here the comparison distribution is not the population distribution, so it's not like a population of individuals that are plotted out. It's the distribution of means for population two. Now we know the mean and standard deviation of population two, which is why we're using a z-test, by the way, because we know the standard deviation. The mean for population two is a 200, and I don't know what kind of weird scale they're rating people's attractiveness on. Maybe they have a whole bunch of questions and they're adding up all the ratings in different ways, and the average rating given for population two. Again, those are the ones that are not told anything about the personality. They rate these people a 200 score. And the standard deviation around that 200, the average amount score that ratings vary around that 200, is 48. So in our sample, we sampled people from population one. There were 64 people that we sampled, and the mean attractiveness rating given was 220. So just without thinking about any statistical significance test, the ratings were on average, the average rating was higher for population one than population two. But the question is, are these two means statistically significantly different from each other? In other words, is it assuming in reality there is no real difference between population one and population two, how unlikely is it to get a mean of 220 for the attractiveness ratings using 64 people, if in reality the average of people that are told these personality characteristics would eventually end up being that 200? That's what we're asking here, basically. So I know that's convoluted, but that's the logic of all of this hypothesis testing stuff that we're doing over most of the class. So there's some scary looking symbols here. Get used to understanding what these symbols are, because you've got to know what they are to understand what we're doing here. So mu is a mean, but because we're looking at a distribution of means, a lot of the symbols are going to have an m subscript to them. So this says mu m. What does that mean? Mu m is the mean for a distribution of means. The mu is the mean. That's the same as it's been in a previous chapter. Mu is the symbol for the population mean, but the subscript m is telling you we're talking about a distribution of means. And so rule one about how we estimate things about the distribution of means is we assume that the distribution of means related to population 2 is going to have the same mean. So the distribution of means is still going to have a mean of 200, just like the population. And that just makes kind of sense if you start to think about what a distribution of means is. Again, if we did a study with 64 people each time, and we did the study, let's say 10,000 times, and we calculated a mean every time, well, on average, the means are going to approximate the population. So the distribution of means, it's the mean of the distribution of means ends up being the same mean as the population. So what's next? Here you see sigma squared, subscript m. And this says that, so that's going to be the variance. Sigma squared is the variance for a distribution of means. So the tricky part about this chapter is that you're introducing a new kind of distribution, and that means now you have to figure out which kind of mean are they talking about, and which kind of variance are they talking about, and which kind of standard deviation are they talking about? Are they talking about the population variance and the population standard deviation, or are they talking about, or maybe they're talking about the sample variance and sample standard deviation, or are they talking about what you really want to know about in this case, which is the variance and standard deviation of the distribution of means? So the easy way, in terms of the symbols, you'll have a little m subscript if it's a distribution of means. When it's not for the distribution of means, there's no m. So here what this is saying is that the variance for the distribution of means is going to be calculated by the variance divided by n. In terms of the standard deviation for the distribution of means, it's going to be calculated by the square root. Just like any other standard deviation, the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. So it's just going to be the square root of this stuff. It's going to be the square root of the variance for the distribution of means. So we can calculate this out, and ultimately what we want to know here is the standard deviation for the distribution of means. So we're given, we know that the standard deviation for the population is 48, so we could plug in 48 into these equations to find the variance for the distribution of means, which ends up being 36. And the square root of 36 is 6. So we have to find, again, the standard deviation for the distribution of means. That's kind of the trickiest part, I'd say. There are several equations online and in the book that help you do that. But the important thing to remember is that they're not talking about a regular standard deviation. If you use the standard deviation for the population that's given, you will get the wrong answer. There's no doubt about that. You've got to use the population standard deviation to calculate the standard deviation for the distribution of means. And the short way to do that, if you're given the standard deviation, is just going to be 40, it's in this case 48, it's going to be the standard deviation divided by the square root of n. So step 3, we're going to determine the cutoff score, the cutoff z-score, on the comparison distribution at which the null hypothesis should be rejected. So exact same step as before, we do it in the exact same way. Now in this case, do we have a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test? Think about the research hypothesis. because we're predicting a particular direction, population 1 is going to be predicted to give higher ratings. That's a directional prediction. That means this can be a one-tailed test. So we know that, and just by convention, the 0.05 significance level is kind of the standard. We use the exact same table we did in the previous chapter, and we can figure out what the cutoff z-score is. We have a one-tailed test because we have a directional prediction. We're using the 0.05 significance level like we often would in psychology, usually would in psychology. And so in this case, here's what the cutoff score would be. Now you have to do a little thinking with the one-tailed test. With a two-tailed test, it's both of the cutoffs. You just have to get something more extreme. But with a one-tailed test, you have to think about, well, what direction are you predicting? In this case, we're predicting that population 1 is going to be higher than population 2. So we're going to use the positive, not the negative, cutoff score. So positive 1.64 is our cutoff z-score. That's what you see right here. For a one-tailed test, for a 0.05 probability, 0.05% p-value cutoff, 1.64 is the cutoff. So we need to see a z-score of more extreme than 1.64. But what's different here, again, we're not talking about the z-scores for the population of individuals. Here we're talking about a z-score on that distribution of means. So that's why we had to figure out the standard deviation for the distribution of means, which is 6 right here. If we had used the standard deviation of up here of 48 for the population, that's going to be very different, and we're ultimately going to get the wrong answer here. So that's our cutoff, positive 1.64 on the distribution of means. Step 4, determine your sample score on that distribution of means, on that comparison distribution. So we know, again, the sample had 64 individuals, and the mean that was found was 220 for the attractiveness ratings. So we're still going to be using the z-score equation just like we have before. The difference is, instead of using the population standard deviation or even a sample standard deviation, we don't use either one of those things. We want to know whether this mean, where this mean would fall in a distribution of means, because we're comparing a mean to a mean, not an individual score to a mean. So we're going to take that 220 minus the population 2 mean, 200. So the numerator is going to be 20, 220 minus 200. And we're going to put that, the size, we're going to see how big is that 20 difference in terms of standard deviations on that distribution of means. So we'll say 20 divided by 6, because again, 6 was the standard deviation of the distribution of means. So 20 divided by 6, and we get an observed z value for that mean of 220 is 3.33. What that means is that on that distribution of means, a mean of 220 is 3 1/3, 3.33 standard deviations above the mean for that distribution of means. Again, that distribution of means comes from population 2, and we're trying to see, basically, is it likely to get this calculated mean with that sample on that distribution of means. So what we're trying to do here is compare this 3.33. Is it more extreme than the 1.64? And of course, that number is bigger than that number, so the answer is yes. So because the mean that we found for attractiveness ratings for those that were told the people had positive personality, that mean is extreme for that distribution of means, so we are going to reject the null hypothesis. So because it's more extreme, we would reject the null hypothesis. That means the research hypothesis is supported, suggesting that when they're told positive things about people's personality, they rate them as more attractive. That would be the idea. So again, you need that same sort of cutoff table to figure out the cutoff score. You got to calculate the z-score in a different sort of way. The only difference is just that you first have to find out what is that standard deviation for the distribution of means, and that's what you're going to use in the z equation. So again, there are important differences between three different types of distributions. We've now encountered all three. We have a sample distribution, so that would be if you take the 64 individuals we had from one sample. Let's say we plotted out their individual attractiveness ratings. That's a sample distribution. So it's scores of individuals, in a single sample. We don't know what shape that's going to be. Now there's also a population distribution. Now you don't usually ever have full access to the population of individuals. You're usually using a sample to estimate a population. But the concept of a population is really important for what we're doing, obviously, based on what you've seen. So a population distribution is also, think of what's actually plotted in that histogram in a distribution. It's still the scores of individuals in the population. A population distribution is often normal, but it could be any shape depending on what the variable is, for example. The symbols differ a little bit. And then the new thing for this chapter that's really important is the concept of a distribution of means. So again, it's not a distribution of individuals' scores, it's a distribution of means from individual studies. So it's means of samples, let's say they're randomly taken from some particular kind of population, and it's the means themselves that make up their distribution. And we know some characteristics of what a distribution of means looks like. We can do like simulations, for example, computerized simulations based on some numbers. And so it's not as imaginary as it might sound. We do know what a distribution of means would tend to look like if you did all these different studies. And an important thing to know is that if your sample size is at least 30 or greater, the bigger the better, the distribution of means is known to approximate a normal distribution. One way there's a video in the class that explains this better. But one way to think about it is that if you're calculating a mean, particularly from a larger sample, you're not going to be likely to get a very extreme score for the mean, because you're going to, on average, if you take a random sample, you might get some extreme individual scores. But the bigger the sample, the more likely they are to balance each other out in both directions. And so when you plot out the means like that, what ends up happening is that the distribution of means, which you're looking at right here, will be more narrow than the distribution of the population. So here you're seeing a population distribution, and here you're seeing a distribution of means. For the same, this is for population too. We see the mean of 200 for the attractiveness ratings. Remember, the standard deviation was 48. So you can see the standard deviation of 48 in both directions. And so these are plots, again, of individual scores. Standard deviation of 48. And so if you calculated estimated a distribution of means, the mean is going to be the same. Because again, if you do the same sort of study a whole bunch of times and calculate the mean each time, on average, the means are going to approximate the mean of the actual population of individuals. But notice the standard deviation is smaller in a distribution of means compared to a population distribution. Again, that's because if you are averaging a whole bunch of individuals, particularly with a large sample size, you're gonna tend to average out the extremes and get the mean that you get is going to tend to be closer to the population mean. So there are some questions throughout this chapter, and I think some later chapters, asking you to select some things in terms of graphs like this. One important thing to remember: both of these are approximately normal distributions, both the population distribution and the distribution of means, but the distribution of means is going to be more narrow than the population distribution. And what that means is the standard deviation is going to be smaller. The variance of standard deviation is going to be smaller in a distribution of means.